Yo, welcome to The Noob and the Knower. In this podcast, we pair a driven beginner with a seasoned vet to explain how to learn basically anything.
This season's anything is how to fly fish. Stick around as we cover the gamut, 101 to the 401, gear, reading water, fishing techniques, and much, much more.
With star of hit video series Modern Nymphing, Fly Fishing Team USA medalist, and professional guide, Lance Egan.
That's right. And here co-hosting and asking the questions on your behalf is avid fly fisher and recently graduated noob, Pablo Signori.
So let's go. Together we'll take you from fishing zero
to fly angling hero faster than you can say, fish on.
Welcome to The Noob and the Knower, Season 1, Episode 2. We are back here with Lance Egan and Ray Blay in the back. What is going on, gentlemen? I am very excited to be covering this because I myself am a gearhead and I like talking about gear. So we need to get people also addicted to gear.
Doing great.
You guys doing okay?
Yeah. Loving it.
You were on the lake today. You were sending me pictures of gigantor fish.
Well, they're not gigantic, but they're good lake fish. Lots of fun.
Ray also went fishing today.
I did.
I chose not to go.
Yeah.
I had to work on stuff because I'm trying to go to the Drift List on Thursday for a solo camping trip. Hopefully that pans out. I already got the camping spot reserved, so hopefully I don't lose my loot. How was your fishing experience, Ray?
It was good. A little tough. Lots of carpies, though. Carp are fun. Carp are friends.
That's right.
Yeah.
For the noobs out there that don't know, carp is actually a highly sought-after species on fly rod. And we will go into that in another podcast, but they're kind of taboo, I think, in every other aspect of life. But for some fly anglers, they are very, very prized. Like our friend Ike Rhodes, who's actually a carp guide.
Oh, yeah.
It's the only thing they want to fish for. They're great fish on the fly because they fight hard and they're hard to catch because most people catch them, with things that have smell and flies don't have scent, so it makes it much more challenging. But anyways, it's now time to get to the real brass tacks here. We're talking about gear today, and this is the All About Gear and Setup podcast. So if you're just getting into fly fishing, then you're going to want to listen to this because there's so much stuff out there, and a big part of this podcast is to demystify kind of the madness of fly fishing, and gear is probably, I think, the top of that list. So I would say, for starters, a lot of people think that you need to have millions of dollars to get into the sport, and I don't think that that's necessarily true, especially if you're just keeping it simple and you're just trying to start out. Really all you need is the basics, which would be a rod, reel, line. You guys with me on this?
For sure.
And then some extra stuff that we'll talk about, which is basically like flies and leader tippet type thing, but then you can add on from there, and there's definitely a package of things that will make things easier for you to start, and it's kind of what everyone suggests you get. But by no means do you have to go the conventional route. You can kind of do things differently. I mean, I certainly did when I first started, and we'll start talking about that as soon as we get into the real nitty-gritty here. But today, just so you know, I failed to mention on the last podcast that I wanted to mention on this one, is that this podcast is meant to almost work like it's a workbook. So it's like you listen to the first one, and then everything you've learned in that first one, you can now apply to the second one. It's going to continue on cumulatively. So by the end of it, you're catching fish. And we're going to want to hear about all the fish you guys catch on the Facebook page and all those sorts of things. So hopefully we're building a community of anglers, fellow noobs that are learning from the man, the myth, the legend, Mr. Lance Egan.
You had that right, the lesser legend. You started down the right path there.
I would say lesser, but since we're on the podcast, I was trying to hook you up. Sorry about that. All right, so we're going to jump in here. I think we're going to do this in a very different, unique way, because most people, when they talk about this stuff, the first thing they jump into is the rod, right? Are you with me on this?
For sure.
Everyone wants to talk about the rod. Oh, and one thing in fly fishing, just for the noobs, we're going to be teaching you how cool kids say it.
Cool kid alert.
The cool kids do not say pole. Don't ever say a pole in fly fishing. People will roll their eyes at you and know that you're a noob. You have to call it a rod. It's a rod, okay? So, but we're going to actually start from the fly and work our way backwards to the rod. As we go adding each thing, it's cumulative, and it just makes more sense from my perspective. I'm dyslexic, but hey, that's okay. So let's start with flies. First and foremost, we'll talk about the different types of flies, and we're going to start with dry flies. Why don't you kind of explain to us a little bit of what a dry fly is, Lance?
In a nutshell, a dry fly floats on the surface. It often imitates something, but it doesn't always. It could be an attractor-style dry fly. It could be an imitative-style dry fly. But a dry fly, at its core, is a floating fly.
Okay, and what's an attractor-style dry fly?
This is Pisces, Varies, an NATK segment where I, Jen Ripple, define fishy words for you. Boom! Attractor pattern, noun. An attractor pattern is a fly designed to grab the attention of the fish. Usually, but not always, these patterns approximate features of various fish food sources instead of realistically imitating them. Example in context. Did you see that male brown trout on the red with 5 females? He must have shown them his attractor pattern.
Attractor style doesn't imitate anything. So where you could have a dry fly that looks like an ant, for instance, that's very imitative. You could also have a dry fly like, let's say, a royal wolf is a very common one that doesn't really imitate any one insect. It could be lots of things. It's got some attracting colors to it. In the case of the royal wolf, it's got a white wing, a peacock-colored body, and a red tag in the middle of the body. So it's known as an attractor style fly because it isn't very imitative.
Yeah, when fish are feeding on the surface, they're under the water and they're looking up and they see things floating by and they come up and they want to grab them. And this style of fly, the dry fly, is constructed so that it imitates those things. Now, he's saying there's different types. There are some that actually look like the things that they're actually trying to eat, and there's others that don't look like the things that they're trying to eat. It looks like something that they would eat. Could be anything, a whole myriad of things. And that's the attractor. All right, so let's talk about hook size, because I think what's crazy about dry flies is that they can actually range kind of a lot in size, right?
For sure. Yeah, you could have dry flies that are huge, right? You could have hook sizes. So hook sizes are, a little bit arbitrary as far as the number goes, but hook sizes are counterintuitive. The higher the number or the bigger the number. A size 20, for instance, is very, very small, and a size 6 is very large hook-wise. So you could have, let's say, a grasshopper imitation tied on a size 6 hook, or 8 or 10, or more hook sizes than that for all intents and purposes. But you could also have, on the flip side of things, a tiny little midge, a tiny little mayfly, a tiny little ant that would be tied on maybe a 16, 18, 20, 22, very small size hooks.
Okay. And some of these hooks get so small, I mean, they look big on the tip of your fingernail. It's crazy how small they get.
For sure. The smallest of hooks would be around a size 30 or 32. And for dry fly purposes, if you're taking out poppers and that kind of stuff, most dry flies seem to stop about size 2. There's, you could get a big stonefly or a large hopper or something that'd be about a 2. Even most mouse patterns, I think you could make them qualify as a dry fly of sorts.
I was going to ask you that about the mouse patterns, because for the listeners, what's gotten kind of popular in the last few years is like fishing at night for brown trout with a fly. When we say pattern, we mean fly that looks like a mouse. So it gets thrown on the surface, it scurries, and it gets hit. Actually, Ray was the first person I ever mouse fished with, and they were nice enough to give me the first shot. It was very sweet.
You broke off a big fish on a mouse too.
Did I?
Yeah, under the bridge.
That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
That was the first time, yeah.
You weren't supposed to bring that part up, Ray.
It came and jumped up. These are all fake stories. Ray's just trying to hook me up here. It came up and he grabbed the fly, and no, I think I missed the hook set on that. I think that's how it actually went. See, that's a good friend right there, ladies and gentlemen. Everyone needs one of those in their life.
Keeping you down to earth.
Yeah, that's right. But yeah, that was one of the things I was going to ask you, because that's like a way bigger hook too, and it's like some of them even have a trailing hook on those flies.
True. We're going off on tangents here about flies, but
okay.
We're going to have a tendency to do that.
Okay, yeah, it's okay. People, they need to be in the ethos, Once you start talking about fly fishing, you kind of go down these roads, Some are darker than others, some are dustier than others. It's okay. It's just part of it.
It is a rabbit hole, and the rabbit hole has no end so far.
I prefer wormhole. Ew.
Wormhole.
All right, so let's keep going. You mentioned the royal wolf, which is a Catskills dry fly, correct?
I don't think it would be called the Catskills style.
No,
I don't know. It's a wolf style, Lee wolf style fly, hair-wing fly. To me, a Catskill style fly would be like with mallard flank or something like that as the wings instead of calf. It would normally have a hackle fiber or a natural, like a duck flank type of tail or a chicken hackle style tail, versus a wolf usually has moose body hair or deer hair as the tail, and then usually has calf body hair as the wing. So I would almost call wolves their own style, like a Catskill style is one and a wolf is another. I could be mistaken there. Some people may classify a wolf as a Catskill. In my mind, it's not.
Interesting. Okay. I did not know that. I just assumed because of the last name that it was some sort of Catskills iteration, but that has since been disproven.
Well, we're not certain of that, but It's a dry fly nonetheless.
It is, yes. Okay. One of the things that I also wanted to ask you about was, so when we're fishing these flies, we need to prepare them in order to float on the water. And that's kind of a big part of fishing dry flies. You use floatant, you use this like silicone powder, and some of the flies that you guys fish in the competition scene are CDC flies, right?
Yeah, or foam or hair wing or all kinds of stuff, yeah.
For some reason, I thought like CDC was kind of like the thing in the Euro thing. I know all the Spanish flies I bought from the guy who ties for the Spanish team sometimes. They were all CDC flies, the dries that he gave me.
CDC is very, very commonly used for sure, but it's certainly not the only thing that's used.
What are you using to keep a CDC fly dry?
There's lots of things you can use. One, there are floatants you can use. Certain floatants work on it, like Loon Loxa, Tiemco Dry Magic, CNF Power Float.
Okay.
There are several of the paste styles, and then also it's good to use powder style floatants with CDC, like Shimazaki Dry Shake or Loon Dust or Top Ride from Loon. I'm forgetting a bunch, but there's all kinds of different powder floatants.
Okay.
Frog's Fanny would be one that's very popular. The other trick with CDC is there's a rubber band hack that you could find on YouTube if you wanted to. There's a rubber band trick that you attach a little rubber band, or I use Spanflex, a fly tying material, and attach it to like a D-ring or a zipper pull or something on your vest or your pack, and just create a loop of it. You connect the hook, you hook the hook to the rubber band, stretch the rubber band on some tippet, and then you strum the tippet, much like Pablo does a guitar. And in about 20 or 30 strums, you don't have a song, but you do have a dry fly.
All right, so let's keep moving. The next thing that I associate a lot with dry flies, and also the next set of flies we're going to cover, is getting a drag-free drift, right? So a big part of fishing these flies in comparison to some other types of flies, which we'll get to later, is that you want them to float as if they're uninfluenced by any human thing that is tethered to it. So it's just floating as if it would normally on the surface, which we talked a little bit about in the last podcast.
True.
So maybe you can just give us one more time, and I think this is going to happen a lot through the course of this podcast, is we're going to repeat ourselves. Personally, I think that's a good thing because repetition is a great way to learn.
For sure.
I was thinking that you could kind of go through the drag-free drift one more time for our listeners.
Absolutely, yeah. And as you mentioned, we'll hit on several topics many, many times because they're recurring kind of rules, soft rules, if you will, that we need to hammer into our own heads all the time as we're remembering how to fish. So, with a dry fly, and really with nymphs in most cases also, there are no hard rules. Your dry flies you could also have with some drag or induce some movement with them to get them to be effective. But generally speaking, skittering caddis, for instance, right. But generally speaking, you want a dry fly to drift at the mercy of the current, like you were saying, Pablo. You want to make it look as though it is not tethered to us via leader, tippet, fly line. You want it to drift naturally as the natural insects might. So if you were an ant or a beetle or a grasshopper that fell onto the river or a lake, you would be at the mercy of whatever current might be there. In a lake, that could be wind, could be none whatsoever. In a river, there's always some current. So that fly just needs to drift the exact same speed as the current in which the fish are feeding.
Okay, great. You remind me of my crazy invention idea. I want to get one of those, like, there's like those little wind-up toys that'll like move across the floor, like they have like spider ones and stuff. I want to get one of those little motors and tie that into my fly and have like little legs that move like a beetle.
Sending off some shock waves, letting the fish know it's alive.
It's going to revolutionize the fly fishing industry. You heard it here first, kids.
I have no doubts.
The next style of fly that you said preemptively was nymphs. Let's talk a little about nymphs. What is a nymph?
Well, a nymph is, in the fly sense, is something that's imitating the larval stages of aquatic insects. So whether you're talking mayflies, stoneflies, caddis, midges, they all have different life stages, life cycles. Most of them start out as an egg. Many then have a larva, sometimes a pupa, and sometimes an adult. Others, like say a stonefly, would just have an egg, a nymph, and an adult. They would not have the pupal stage.
What'd you call me?
I called you lots of things, but that was off camera.
Okay.
like a caddis or a midge would have the egg, the larva, the pupa, and the adult. And then sometimes they would even have a spinner, an adult that's dying and has mated and is then laying back on the water. It basically has used all of its energy to create new life.
All those iterations are represented by nymph-style flies. Is that correct?
Yeah, except for the floating on the surface. The spinner or the adult would usually be a dry fly versus we don't imitate insect eggs. Thank goodness, those would be really small. But we do imitate the nymphs or the larva and or the pupa.
And then just to kind of explain a little bit, he's naming a whole range of insects, but those insects are kind of commonly found in rivers all over the world. So as you start getting into this, and we'll do a whole podcast on that, but as you start getting into this, you'll start hearing these names like, caddis, mayfly, stonefly. And they become super familiar. So right now they might sound kind of crazy, but they become very familiar and there's not too many of them. There's different phases of their lives, which adds to it, but you don't even really need to know that. You just need to know which flies kind of represent the actual insect you're seeing out on the river.
True. And when you're starting, I think it's important. We encourage people in the shop all the time to, when they're not, nobody starts out with a full knowledge of entomology. Heck, I've been doing it for 30 plus years and I don't have a full knowledge of entomology, but we encourage people to just kind of look. If they're seeing insects hatch on the river, take a look at them, try and catch one so you can look at it closely in your hand and check out the colors of the body, maybe the style of wing. Is it an upright wing? Is it a tent style wing? And on. And then find something in your box that has the closest silhouette to what you're seeing on the water. And over time, you're like you say, Pablo, people are going to learn about the different types of insects. But if you're not sure what it is, it doesn't matter. The trout don't know it by name either. They just know what it looks like. So if you've got a fly that is close in silhouette and you can make your imitation look like the naturals, you're in business.
That's right. That's why probably on the next podcast, if Lance can't make it, I'll just get someone that kind of looks like him and just put him on there on the other side of the Zoom that we got going here.
Perfect.
And it'll work. I mean, that's just how it works when you're talking about fishing.
The listeners might have bigger brains than an almond like a trout has.
Oh, okay. So hopefully they do. Otherwise, they're not going to learn much.
I'm pretty sure they do.
So I think what's interesting also about the nymph thing is that there's kind of a bunch of old school patterns that everyone was using. Patterns kind of change over time. I think maybe and this is just me generalizing from what I've seen, but it seems like every decade kind of has their signature flies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I hear you.
Now we have a bunch of new patterns that probably your grandfather doesn't use, or maybe he does. But there's a bunch of new styles that people are getting into and using, like the Paragon is a really good example of that. Mm-hmm. Maybe you could just talk a little bit about how much that matters, if it does matter, if you think that these patterns actually, change your success on a river or not. Part of the reason I was saying this is because my brother has a friend who got into fly fishing, and he was sending me pictures of fish he had caught, and I kept on seeing, these older patterns. Some of them weren't super old, like Copper John or something, but I was like, that's interesting he's using those. I wonder what he's reading, what is pointing him towards these certain flies. There's so many flies that work. People just get consumed with flies, but as we go on with the podcast, and as I've learned from watching you, actually, it's more about the presentation than it is actually the fly that you have.
True.
But I was just curious if you thought there was any correlation to old to new, if it does matter, or if it's you can use kind of any of those patterns as long as they're representing the correct insect.
Yeah, I don't think that it matters as far as will it work or won't it work? I hear people all the time suggest that fish learn flies, but I think people are forgetting that trout, most of them have a 4 or 5 year life expectancy. So they, if they learned about, the Copper John 3 years ago, then by next year they probably forgot because they're new fish.
Right.
You can catch fish on all kinds of stuff. As you mentioned, I teach and preach presentation trumps fly pattern. That said, I think there are advantages to a lot of newer flies. Most flies that are catching on, let's call it, pun intended, that are
snagging on.
Yes, most that are selling well currently are maybe improved flies, right? Whether they are, in the case of a nymph, they might be more dense. They may have a newer type of hook, a jig hook, for instance, or a sharper style hook, or a barbless hook. In the case of a dry fly, it may be made of materials that float better than some of the old flies. There are always improvements. I can tell you, I'm a fly designer. I make part of my living designing flies for Umpqua Feather Merchants, nets, and I'm always striving to find flies that float better, or that I can catch fish on more consistently, or that sink faster, or that I stay in contact with better, and on and on. Just, I think, and I'm not the only one doing that. There are hundreds and hundreds of quality fly tyers out that are pushing the envelope all the time, trying
Not
to...
like you, Lance, okay? Stop saying that.
Yeah, well, probably not like me. They are probably doing it much more efficiently with a lot less clutter if you looked around the room here. But all jokes aside, I mean, I think new sells no matter what we're talking about, and in the case of flies are no exception for sure. But I think just like all things, they're always new and improved. Hopefully, just a little bit.
Right.
There are certainly classics that will catch fish, but new is better.
Are there any new
cases.
flies that you think are just total, like, it's just a sales pitch?
Oh, sure. There's lots of them,
really?
But I don't want to call people out publicly.
Okay, fair enough.
In the fly world industry or fly fishing industry, I'm sure Ray over there can attest. We have what we call flies that have bin appeal and flies that actually catch fish.
Right.
There are flies that catch fishermen, and they're designed to catch fishermen. They look really neat. They have about 89 bazillion steps to tie them, so nobody wants to make them, and they look really cool in the fly box. And some of them actually even look almost exactly like the natural fly. The problem with those is usually they don't have any movement. They don't look very realistic underwater. They look like it out of water. Yeah, I think there are lots of flies that are poorly designed for fishing, very well designed to catch fishers.
Okay.
Fishermen and women.
Okay, fair. Good to know. People, take that. It's food for thought.
Put a lot on your plate. I rhymes are so fat that you might gain weight.
Yeah, that happens from time to time, people. Don't worry. My top's still on. We're continuing. Okay, so next set of flies here. Streamers. This is a big one because they've gotten, well, pun intended, because they are kind of big sometimes, but not the ones you fish in your Euro world, but the ones that this guy fishes are gigantic at times.
Yes.
Go big or go home.
There you go. That's the phrase. I think the pike would agree.
Oh yeah.
But so streamers. What is a streamer?
A streamer could be lots of things, but it's a fly, we call it still, right? But it's not imitating a fly like people are thinking. It's not imitating a house fly or a bumblebee, which are not really imitated by fly fishers anyway, even though lots of noobs think that they are.
What about the honey hatch?
The honey hatch?
I just made that up.
You and Winnie the Pooh would probably like it.
No.
But outside of that, I think we're safe. Streamers are, flies, if you will, but they're usually imitating things that move, that you can animate. So minnows, leeches, crayfish, and things of that nature.
Okay.
They tend to be bigger. Yeah, bait fish, bigger forage for sure.
Okay. To backtrack a tiny little bit, dry flies stay on the surface. Nymphs, wet flies, streamers, they all are underneath the water. They're subsurface flies that we use. So streamers also have a pretty big hook size range, and a lot of these things come bigger. So if you go to your fly shop and you go to the streamer section, you're going to see these things that look like they're trying to be fish. And I think they're probably the closest in fly fishing to what a traditional fisher person would use if they're using some sort of plastic lure, crankbait,
most
whatever,
like lures.
Pisces, berries, boom.
Fishing lure. Noun. A fishing lure is a type of artificial bait which is designed to attract a fish's attention. The lure uses movement, vibration, flash, and color to entice fish. Example in context. Did you see that new fully enclosed, fully submersible flashing wader suit? It turns your whole body into a fishing lure.
I actually started, when I first started fly fishing, this guy took me out and it was streamer fishing, and that's kind of what I got into. I never really fished for trout until later. I started just fishing streamers here on the lakefront, and then I went to South Carolina and fished on the beach. It can be a very enjoyable way to fish also. And then once you start fishing streamers for trout, it gets real interesting because you start catching some pretty badass looking dudes, because the bigger fish tend to go after the streamers, it seems like. Although you can catch really big fish on dries and nymphs, obviously. But
true.
So that's kind of the streamer deal. I wanted to get your opinion on this, because a lot of streamers come with a weight built into them, whether it be, dumbbell eyes or some sort of cone head or lead wraps underneath everything on the hook shank.
Sure.
Is there ever a time where you use an unweighted fly and a sinking line, which we'll get to lines in a second, but...
Yeah, lots of times. There are lots it's very situational. Every situation situation is unique, but definitely you want to have some streamers that are weightless, some that are even buoyant sometimes, and some that are sinking with various weights to accommodate different depths. Sometimes, fish are feeding right near the surface and you don't want a weighted fly. Sometimes a weighted fly hits the water so hard that it scares the fish. Sometimes if you have a floating fly and the fish are all 12 feet down, you're wasting your time with a floating fly. Right. So and everywhere between. So yeah, to be really well set up, you'd have a good selection of all the above. Okay. From buoyant to unweighted to lightly weighted to medium weighted and absolute bomb heavyweights.
Okay. Do you ever fish a booby fly?
Okay.
Not for about, what time is it? About 3 or 4 hours now.
Oh, wow. Does your wife know?
Yeah, I tell her all the time.
Oh, okay, just making sure. Okay, so you're a fan of the booby.
She's in the loop, man. She's in the loop. Boobies are really cool flies. Yeah, they're a buoyant fly, as we're alluding to, that have round eyes, but they're foam eyes, and so the fly floats, if you will. We oftentimes fish it with a sinking line or an intermediate line, and you can use that to float up off the bottom, or you can also use the floating type fly with a sinking line to manipulate where the rest of your flies go. So I was using it in a lake today, where I was using it to keep my other flies from hanging up on the bottom. So I had the booby fly, the floating fly on the point, and I had 2 other flies between my sinking tip and the booby that were unweighted.
That's some Jedi stuff right there. Would you concur? Right?
Oh man, I like that a lot.
We call that a washing line rig.
Oh, really? Mm-hmm. That's very cool. Yeah, we are going to have to do some Stillwater stuff. By the way, for the listeners, Stillwater is just lake fishing, but because we're pretentious, we call it Stillwater.
Well, it could be reservoir fishing too. So you can't see Stillwater is all inclusive.
We're gonna get to lines and stuff, and I know you're real picky about people using like nylon and mono and fluoro and these words.
No. Yes, okay. Go on.
I know about you. So this is another one, the Reservoir Lake one. We're uncovering the nuances of Lance Egan's perpetual annoyances.
Oh yeah.
We just finished flies, which is crazy because we have so much to cover still. This might end up being a 2-parter, which is fine. But so what does the fly do? The fly goes on what's called a leader. Okay. A leader for me was like this thing that I did not understand when I was regular fishing. I was just like, I did not get the point of a leader. Now, as a fly fisher, I really understand it. I still kind of don't understand it for regular fishing unless you have like toothy fish, but obviously that's because I'm a noob when it comes to traditional fishing. But for fly fishing, it makes a lot of sense. Let's get into that a bit. So tell me what a leader is.
Well, a leader in fly fishing, I most of the time start out by telling people that it's most often tapered is the leader, because people coming from conventional fishing will feel like the leader is what we call tippet in fly fishing, right? So tippet is level. It's all one size, one diameter per spool. And if you get a leader, a tapered leader out of the package, it usually is just that it tapers. Usually goes from thick to thin. Yeah. It is monofilament all the time. That one's for you, Pablo.
Thank you.
It can be fluorocarbon or it can be nylon. Both are monofilaments.
There you go.
There you go. There's the pet peeve. A leader helps do lots of things. One, it helps transmit energy from the fly line. The fly line, as we established a little bit in our last podcast, and I'm sure we'll talk about it more in this one or in the next one, but the fly line is carrying energy with it, and it's helping propel and carry the fly with it also. And the leader helps, it starts with a thicker diameter that is usually nearly the same diameter as the tip of the fly line to help transmit that energy, and then it starts to lose diameter throughout the leader, thus the taper, and it also then loses energy, so it kind of brings a predictable delivery to your fly. Leaders come in all lengths and diameters. You could have 1 pound leader or a 50-pound leader. Right. You could also have them super long and super short. So it's a very general term, but in a nutshell, it is the clear transition because it's nylon or fluorocarbon. It's relatively clear from your fly line to your fly, and it tapers and helps deliver the fly.
Okay, and I'd like to add to that a bit.
Please.
Because we're going to talk about tippet later, and tippet to me is kind of like a subset of leader. But I think the other purpose of the leader is actually to separate your fly line from the fish, because fly line has color, it has mass, so when it lays down, if you just use a fly line, it would scare the fish. They would see it, or it would splash, or it would be very obvious that you were trying to do something nefarious to them.
For sure.
But what the leader does is it actually separates that clunky fly line from your fly and allows the fly to land naturally as if it was just a regular fly, or if it was a streamer, it was just swimming around. So it keeps a distance between your fly line and the fish you're trying to catch.
Perfect.
Check.
The next thing we should talk about, which you kind of alluded to a little bit, is that I think within the different types of leaders, there's also a lot of that is dictated by the species that you're chasing. Because if you're trying to chase a tarpon, you're going to use a much different leader than you would, a little small stream brook trout, right?
Yeah. Tarpon in the saltwater, that's going to be, maybe 20 pounds on the small end of things and 200 pounds on the large end of things, is going to require a different leader material than a half a pound brook trout, right?
Yeah. Let's just start out with a little warm water leader situation. Ray, I don't know if you want to chime in and tell me, what do you think is like a good basic leader? And maybe both you guys can answer this, but is a knotless leader that you buy at the store better than something you tie on your own?
It's Ray.
Definitely for a beginner, I would say it is, and that's how I started out. The benefit to a knotless leader is you don't really have to do any of the thinking on your own. You go to the fly shop, you pick out, a leader in this X system that ranges generally from 0 to 7X. And that all depends on the actual diameter of the line that you're fishing. But for
No, I use 9X, bro.
Yeah. Oh yeah, 9X.
Trout Hunter 9X.5 only.
Ooh, tiny stuff.
Big fish.
For panfish, I think it would be completely reasonable to fish anything from 3 to 5X.
It's very informative.
I try to be. For bass fishing, depending on the size of fly, that you're fishing, that can range anywhere from, 4X to pond bass all the way up to 0X. And I even fish, in some cases, 20 pound, depending on the abrasion resistance that I require for warm water species.
That's because there's like rocks and riprap and stuff that can kind of scrape up your leader?
Yeah, absolutely. And that not to get off on a tangent there, but it also kind of depends on the water clarity that I'm fishing too. I want to be able to fish as heavy of a line as I can to ensure that I'm able to get my fish in, and in case I snag up, I can get my fly back.
Okay, let's talk about some trout leaders. What do you think is like a good standard setup? And I don't know if did I talk to you about this? I don't know if I actually did, and maybe this isn't the time to do it, but the dilemma that I constantly am having when it comes to teaching new people coming to fly fishing is whether to start them on Euro or whether to just get them going with traditional fly fishing, which I think is a better approach, but it's not as successful at the start a lot of times. So I don't know. I mean, I think when it comes to leaders, it becomes kind of convoluted because there's so many different styles of fishing, especially when you're talking about the trout. So maybe you can decide which thing is best to do for a beginner and then go on and tell us what type of leader that would require.
Sure. Well, to me, a beginner, getting them into it, the choice of technique comes down to what I think they'll have the most success with initially. So that could vary a lot depending on where you are and time of year and so on. Sometimes an indicator rig or a Euro rig would be a very good choice. Sometimes it's dry fly fishing. Sometimes it's streamer fishing. We again go off into tangents here, but I don't think there's one right or wrong way to start people.
Okay.
The leaders for trout fishing, if you were to say that there's one kind of common, the most commonly sold trout leader is probably a 9-foot 5X.
Yeah.
X is a diameter scale, has nothing to do with pound test, 100% to do with diameter. So 5X is 6/1000ths of an inch is all that means. So on the thin end of that leader, it's 6/1000ths of an inch. That's all that 5X is telling you. The 9-foot part is telling you the length, and then you can get them in different materials, be those fluorocarbon or nylon.
But isn't it that like sometimes you'll compare like a 6X or a 5X or a 4X from different companies and they all use that same blanketed name, but the diameters are not the same. Like you can physically see one's thicker than the other.
Well, that probably is true because there are some companies that cheat the system a little bit.
The system is a lie.
But the system is in place to try and keep the X's strictly diameter. What can vary a lot is the pound test. If you just took 5X tippet or leader out of the package from any number of manufacturers, they're all going to be within like a 0.005 of an inch. They're all going to be very, very similar. So I don't think you'll find a lot of variability there. And the X, where you will find it is in the quality of the material. And that is, if you're buying an inexpensive material, whether that's nylon or fluorocarbon, you're likely losing some pound tests and breaking strength.
I see.
You could have two materials. You could have, 5X, since we're talking it right now, that are two materials that are the exact same diameter, but one breaks at 5.5 pound and one breaks at 3 pound.
I see.
There's a difference in quality in those two. They're the exact same diameter, one just is stronger.
So which leader would you recommend then for any sort of beginning person?
So again, it's going to come down to your technique and the size of fish, size of fly. There are lots of variables.
situational.
The most common leaders are 7.5 to 9 foot in length, and let's say 3 to 5x in diameter.
Okay.
So as Ray was alluding to, that's probably putting you in pound test range. That's putting you somewhere between about 8.5 pound and about 4 to 5 pounds.
Okay, and so and that's more geared towards maybe dry fly fishing, right?
Yeah, dry fly fishing or nymphing, either way, right?
Okay.
You could nymph. Some people around the West will nymph with 3x, sometimes with big stone flies and things. Where most places, I think people are nymphing with 4x, 5x, 6x.
Okay.
You know, being 4 and 5 probably being most common, unless the fish are really selective, the water's really clear, or you're fishing tiny flies.
What about Euro nymphing? What would you start someone on a Euro rig on?
Tippet wise or leader wise?
Leader wise.
Leader wise, I would start them on something that is a little easier to turn over. So for a Euro rig, a little bit thicker diameter, maybe a 20 pound or 15 pound. You're talking 017, 015, something like that. Maybe as thick as 019 diameter, thousandths of an inch butt section to have a little more predictable delivery. And then as somebody gets used to Euro nymphing, I would encourage them to get thinner and thinner with their leader setup.
So we've talked about flies. The fly goes on the leader. The leader goes on the fly line. Okay. So we're now at the fly line.
Let's pause. Sorry, Pablo, I'll interrupt you there. I want to just cover one more thing about leaders that I think is important for newcomers to the sport. That is, leaders, the longer the leader is, the harder it is to cast with just about everything, right? But the longer the leader is, as you eloquently put earlier, the longer the leader is, the more it separates the impact of the fly line from the fly.
Right.
So it's important to note that. So when you need to be really delicate, when you walk up as a new angler to a beaver pond for the first time and you tie on your 7.5 foot taper leader you got with your outfit has been cut back to where it's like 5 feet long, and you hammer doesn't matter what size fly it is down there on that still beaver pond that's shallow water and totally still, you're going to send every fish in that beaver pond running for its life, right? Versus if you had a really long leader, a 12, 14, 15, as long as you can stand casting leader, it's going to be much harder to deliver the fly, but it's going to set down very, very soft, and you have much less risk of scaring those fish before you get a chance to catch them. So use leader diameter, both diameter and length, to your advantage. The diameter difference, thicker diameter is stiffer and therefore carries more weight with it easier and is easier to cast, easier to turn over, if you will. So if you're dealing with wind or something like that, you might cut your leader back to where it's shorter and a little bit thicker to help kick things over and use a thicker material. Versus when you want to be really delicate and set a fly down very, very soft, then you want to have a super long leader, as long as you can stand casting, and as thin diameter as you can stand using. Just kind of in a nutshell, those will help a lot of anglers just wrap their mind around what to do in each situation. There is no perfect leader for all situations. You can get by with something in the middle.
Yeah.
But to really fine tune and get dialed into each situation, you're going to have to adapt your leaders. So you'll want to carry a range of them, or at least have some different sizes of tippet with which you can adapt your leader to meet the conditions you encounter.
Okay, that's great. And do you suggest beginners buy like the pre-made ones, or should they think about tying their own?
Yeah, I think it's best to buy the pre-tied, knotless leaders out of the gates. If down the road, if you want to get really into some sort of leader building, then it's cool to build your own leaders. You can fine tune them again and make them long. Like a lot of my dry fly fishing for small dry flies is done with leaders that are much longer than are commercially available. So I kind of have to tie them.
Right. How long are you fishing for real technical situations like that?
Oh, usually about 16 to 20 feet. 18, 19 feet is really common for me.
Yeah.
But that's crazy long, really hard to turn over, and only with small flies. You're not doing that with a big grasshopper or something. That's with the size 14, 16, 18, 20 type flies.
The Spaniard guy that is kind of like he's one of my mentors basically, but
Andrés Torres Garcia.
he gave me his leader recipe. And it was like 2 weeks ago, we went to this like kind of glamping situation with my wife. So I was just like practicing casting. And I was like, the first time I tried using that leader, I was like, I can't do this. So then this time I was like, oh, enough time's passed. I'm better now. Let me try it out. And I had the hardest time. It's probably like 17 and a half feet long.
Yeah, it's hard to cast.
And it was really hard. But I had taken like a size 14 El Caricatus and like clipped the hook on it so that I could use it as just a practice fly.
Sure.
And maybe that's why it was too big. I don't know. I hadn't even thought about that.
It's a medium. I mean, shouldn't be too big, but depending on the butt diameter.
I like big butts.
of the leader and the tippet you're throwing and how much transition you had. We're getting technical,
Right.
but there are lots of variables there that could have made that challenging. It's hard. I mean, even with a tiny fly that's not very wind resistant, it's hard to cast a long, 15 plus foot leader. Is just hard to manage. Not something you want to start with, but you could start with a 9 or 10 foot leader for delicate presentations and maybe stretch it to 11 or 12 when needed and shorten it to, 7.5 when you need to deal with wind or turn over a large fly.
Okay, so we have the fly goes on the leader goes on the fly line. And so let's talk about these fly lines. According to many sources that I've seen, this is kind of the golden era of fly lines right now. That's what everyone's saying.
Agreed.
Alongside the golden era of fly tying. So we're kind of in this golden hotspot, kids. Which we should all be very grateful for. So why is it the golden era of fly lines?
I think we're just having a combination of technologies that have come together and understanding to make fly lines. It used to be, even just when I started fly fishing, it wasn't, relatively speaking, it wasn't that long ago. If somebody that's brand new will hear me say I've been fly fishing for 30 years and they think that that's a long time, but I'm relatively new. There's people who have been doing it for 20 or 30 years longer than me, right? But in my 25 plus years of selling fishing tackle, the fly line assortment, the availability of different lines for almost we almost have a fly line. We have carp fly lines now. We have trout fly lines. We have pike fly lines. We have muskie fly lines. We have bass tapers. We have bonefish tapers and tarpon and stripers and redfish and on and on and on. Mm-hmm. We even have lines that are designed to cast certain types of flies, like a clouser line, and there's billfish lines. Anyway, we can go on and on about these things, but like you say, the golden age is now. When I first started, we had like floating lines and a couple sinking lines, and that was about it. And they maybe had 4 or 5 different tapers in floating lines, but that was across several companies, not just in one company. And nowadays, there's so many options, and the lines are just getting better and better. They float higher, they're slicker, they last longer.
Faster, stronger.
Fly lines have really made, with all the different tapers and things, just like the leader, as we talked about, you can make a fly line turn over really hard or turn over very soft. So you could have a fly line for delicate presentations, or you could have a fly line designed to deliver a very large wind resistant fly or a very dense fly. So we have tons of options in fly lines that are making the fly delivery that much easier. So that, I think that's what you're alluding to with the golden age of fly lines. It is definitely now. It's getting better and probably won't slow down anytime soon.
Okay, so let's kind of go through these different types of lines, at least the ones that we practically use that are kind of more standard. We don't have to go out onto the crazy ones, but if you're just trout fishing, if you're just doing the old dry fly fishing or nymph fishing, what would be a typical line? Because I know there's double tapered or Euro line, there's sinking lines. What would be a standard line? And how important, because this is another thing that I noticed, especially when I bought my last rod, how important matching the line is to the actual rod, because I think that makes a big difference.
Yeah, it can make a difference for sure. I would argue the most standard lines sold these days are, for trout fishing at least, is a floating line.
Why are you arguing?
If you had one, I'd like to argue. It's part of my. It's in my nature.
Okay, fair.
Because I don't know. We got to have a battle at some point.
It's true. We gotta lock flies, bro.
The fly lines that are most popular, that are most sold, are weight forward floating fly lines, and they vary in taper a little bit, but generally speaking, a weight forward is the most popular, and then floating, versus sinking versus sinking tip is the most universal, because you can use it with floating flies, or you can also attach flies to a floating line via the leader and tippet that will also sink. So you could fish a floating line on the surface, right at the surface, or below the surface and quite deep with weighted flies, versus if you buy a sinking line, you're limited to only fishing subsurface. Okay. So that's what makes the floating line the most popular. That's what basically every trout combo kit, rod reel line combination kit comes with. None of them come with sinking lines. They all come with a floating line.
And you mentioned weight forward. For any of the listeners, if they're buying their brand new outfit or whatever, and they're like, okay, I'm looking at the line, you'll see a WF on there. That's what weight forward is.
True.
What about double taper? Does anyone use those anymore? Before, it was a way to you could turn it around, and now you have a brand brand new fly line, you can just take off the backside and flip it around because
Flip
they're
it and
like
reverse
a
it.
palindrome, basically.
Right.
Is people are still using those, or is that for like delicate presentation and stuff like that? Is that what it's for, or what is it for?
No, it's not really. That's a good popular myth in fly fishing, that double tapers are more delicate than weight forwards. If you just take the grain weight of a 5 weight, regardless of the double taper or weight forward, the first 30 feet weighs exactly the same. So it's I've had this conversation with line designers and lots of people in the industry over the years, and everybody that's in the know agrees that the double taper cannot physically be more delicate just because it's a double taper. In fact, it's at longer distances, it's less delicate because it stays thick longer. You know, the weight forward starts thin, tapers to thick, and then tapers back down to thin for the remainder of the line. Double taper starts thin, tapers to thick, stays thick all the way to the terminal end of the opposite end of the line, and then it tapers down to thin again. So as you increase the distance in a cast with a double taper, you're hitting the water with more and more impact.
Interesting.
Now, that said, at most trout distances, let's say most trout fishing is done inside of 50 feet, and really most of it's inside of probably 30 feet. And at that distance, a weight forward and a double taper would weigh the exact same, assuming they're the same taper otherwise.
What? There's smoke coming out of my ears right now. This is a lot of computation.
There's a myth we can dispel right there, that the double tapers are not more delicate than weight
All
forwards.
right, very cool. You heard it here first, kids. This is what we do, the noob and the knower.
There are double taper lines still available. Not very many, but there are some. And there are also level fly lines available.
Okay.
Weight forward's the easiest. You get the most distance quicker with weight forward. And there are far, far more taper options available in weight forward because they're the best sellers.
Okay.
So, like in the shop I work in, we carry like maybe two models of double tapers and probably 100 different weight forwards.
Oh, wow.
And I'm throwing round numbers out there.
Yeah.
It could be more than 100. It might be a little less, but I don't think we have more than 2 double tapers.
Okay.
And then level lines, before they had the technology to taper lines, they did a lot of level lines. That was kind of the first style of fly line, is just level. Then once they figured out how to taper, then they transmit energy better with the taper designs. Really the only level lines that are popular now are for Euro nymphing,
Right.
really, really super thin lines that don't need any taper.
Okay.
Because we're not using them to propel the flies through the air.
I didn't realize that that before lines were not tapered. That's really interesting. That's gonna make me like my Euro line a little bit better.
It's old school,
Yeah,
right?
it is. It's kind of sweet. I didn't realize that. I've been on the fence about the whole Euro line thing because I was using laser line for a while, like just as my line. But in the winter, it's just brutal. It's just not fun.
As a man-to-man tip, I would recommend not sitting on fences. Just choose a side and jump off. Fences are not fun to sit on.
That's probably true. That's probably true.
Don't be on the fence of Euroline. Get yourself a Euroline.
Well, I have
You'll
one,
love
and
it.
now I like it. It's like it's
Okay,
much easier
see?
to strip
See?
in.
Don't be a fence sitter.
It's much easier to strip in. It's definitely better.
Much.
Okay, so anyways, lines. I mean, it's so loaded, and when you're first starting out, I think maybe you can just recommend one line. It doesn't have to be the brand or anything, but would you just say like a weight forward line that matches the rod that you're getting is a good buy?
Yeah, for sure. You need to match the line weight of the line to the line weight recommended on the rod. So if you're buying a 5 weight rod, you want a 5 weight line.
Okay.
Outside of that, yeah, we could do a whole podcast and probably will at some point on fly lines and how to match them to rods, because you can buy rods with different speeds, if you will. You can get or actions different. You can get a slow or a medium or a fast or an ultra fast.
We're about to get into that in a little second here.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so and then you can get a line that accommodates each style of rod for sure.
And now, a word from our sponsors.
From the vise to the boat, to the bank, to those moments you connect to a fish, Loon Outdoors is with you every step of the way, with tools designed at the bench and on the water to help make your best day on the water better.
So let's keep moving on with this. So the line, what does the line do? It goes on the reel, right? Like I said, we're moving backwards, and there's a reason, and you can see why now, because everything goes onto itself. So the line goes onto the reel, and the reel is probably like the most underappreciated thing in fly fishing. And on one side of it, I think that there's probably a good reason for that, because it's just basically a glorified line holder,
right?
Like, I don't know, a lot of the time. Unless maybe you're like Ray and you're going out for carp like you did today. In that case, you're going to need a nice reel. So let's talk a little bit about these reels. Let's start from like historically like the most basic one, which is like click and paw, right? Is that correct?
That sounds right to me.
Okay, so what is that? Because I think that's kind of like the most basic. You can still get them and they're cheap, and it would be, if you're doing trout, I think it's a great way to get into it is you just get a click and paw reel. They're cheap, and there's probably a nice one that you can get for cheap. It might be better than buying like some sort of entry level reel that has some sort of drag system or something. I don't know. This is just my personal opinion, but maybe you can comment a little bit about that. Maybe you completely disagree.
No, I don't. I think you could do a lot of trout fishing with a click paw reel for sure. A click paw reel does not have an adjustable drag, so they can, but it doesn't adjust very much. Basically, a click paw reel has a gear on the inside most of the time of the spool, and the frame, rather than the spool, has usually some pawls, thus they call it the click paw, which are usually triangular, I don't know what you want to call them, mechanisms that meet the teeth on the little gear.
Okay.
And as you reel it kind of has high and low spots that the little cone-shaped or triangle-shaped mechanism contacts with the gear. So it has some adjustment. Usually they're pushed onto the gear with a little bit of a spring. So they have a little bit of adjustment, but not very much. But for trout fishing, you don't need a $900 reel for trout fishing.
Right.
We don't really, but if we're getting down to nuts and bolts, you don't really need to fly fish for trout fishing either. So you don't need to fly. You don't need to fish at all. Yeah. So need is not a worry. But you could spend easily $1,000 on a fly reel. You could also easily spend $30 or $40 on a fly reel. Right. They will vary a lot in quality, but they won't often vary a lot in capability of catching fish. There are always exceptions to everything we're going to say. This is fishing. It's not an exact. But there are no hard rules here. But
except for most that, you're good at it.
No, that's it. There are exceptions. Trust me. There are days that are exceptions to that rule for sure. Just like all things. But a reel does not have. It doesn't have to have a super slick drag to be able to land most trout. If you're using crazy fine tippet or you're fishing for really large trout, that might be a big deal. But most trout fishing is done without even really messing with the reel. The reel is a line holder. Right. So to your point, a click paw would work fine. That said, there aren't very many click paw reels available. So there are more disc drag reels available that are all the way down to $30, $40, $50. So you could really get a disc drag reel for a pretty reasonable price.
I was just going to say, maybe you should explain what drag is so people understand why. Because a click paw reel, you use your hand kind of as the drag mechanism, whereas the disc drag reels, they have a mechanism that allows that you can set
and adjust on the fly.
Exactly. Ew. So maybe you can talk a little bit about the drag.
Yeah. So a reel with a drag has an adjustable tension. So when you're reeling in line, there is no tension. It's the same all the time. But as the fish takes line off or you pull line off of the reel, you have an adjustable drag, they call it. Much like spinning or bait casting style reels, except that on a fly reel, it's single action. So for the drag to work, you have to let go of the handle. Versus on, say, a spinning reel, the drag works separate from the handle. You can still hold onto the handle and the drag can still be letting line out. On a fly reel, because it's single action, most of them are anyway. There are some anti-reverse reels, but very few. The line coming off the reel, let's say a fish is fighting and pulling line away from you, to allow that reel handle to move, you'd have to take your left hand, if you're a right-handed caster, off the reel and allow line to be pulled off the reel. And that tension is adjustable based on the drag. So there are different types of drags, but generally speaking, they have an adjustment on the backside of the reel that you can make that tension, harder to pull off or easier to pull off.
Well, that's a drag.
No, it's not a drag at all, except that it is.
Hey-o. Okay, great. A lot of this stuff gets like real deep, real quick, which is okay. But for the listeners, I did want to kind of just walk them through why we keep saying that the reel is kind of just a line holder. Because what's different between fly fishing and traditional fishing is that what you would do, like when you're about to cast or something, is you'll actually take your fly line and you'll just rip it off of the reel. You'll start pulling it off. It's called stripping line, if you will. You'll start taking it off the reel and just leaving it in a pile at your feet. That's kind of how that's like your setup before you cast. Go ahead. You're going to say something. I can see you.
I'm not. I'm listening. You're dead on. Okay. You're pulling line off the reel before you make a cast. I like that.
Yes. So you're kind of
You don't want to be pulling line off while you're casting. Sorry, I cut you off.
No,
there.
you're fine. Yeah, that's although I've done that sometimes.
Well, you can do it, but it ruins your line and it ruins your reel because when you do it while you're casting, you pull line off and against the line guard on the bottom of the reel, and it's pulled at a bad angle, and it ruins your line and grooves your reel eventually.
That's probably why my line's ruined.
Oh yeah,
That's good to know.
I've seen reels with line guards that are just toothed up.
Oh yeah,
Interesting.
the grooves can be very thick.
That's groovy.
You wouldn't think that a PVC or a PE fly line could dig into an aluminum reel, but they will bury into there after a while. There's just enough
Friction,
who knows what, friction there that it just cuts right through it, and then eventually starts ruining your fly line.
Interesting. That's good to know. Yeah, I don't do that very often, but I bet I used to. My first fly line is just battered and abused. I mean, the thing is sad. It looks like a piece of ramen or something. But yeah, that's why the reel only has so much significance. Now, if you're going for saltwater, then ignore everything we said. You should get a reel, and you should get a reel with sealed drag because that means it's designed so that water does not get in and corrode the gears of it. But for freshwater fishing and specifically for trout, the reel is it's not that important. The last thing that we haven't talked about as far as reels go is this magic word called arbor, which is interesting because from my understanding, arbor is a word that has to do with trees, but that's completely unrelated in this case.
It sure could be. Well, the arbor is a tree. If you're an arborist, the arbor in a fly reel is the surface that you're winding the line onto. And we should mention probably that you attach the fly line to backing, to Dacron backing in most cases, and then the backing attaches to the reel. Backing is your insurance policy. The fly lines are usually about 90 feet long is most common. So if you made a 50-foot cast, hooked a giant fish, and it decided to swim 40 feet the other direction, with just a fly line, you're out of line. So then you break, said fish of a lifetime off and make you say curse words, and then Pablo has to go home and confess to his wife that he said bad words. But
Again.
To negate that, we attach backing, which is much thinner diameter and much less expensive than fly line, but has the same breaking strength generally as the core of the fly line.
Okay.
So it's just as strong. You can get more capacity on the bottom of the reel, and they don't need to make fly lines any longer because we're not using most of the time more than 30 or 40 or 50 feet, and they're already 90 feet long, and they're already plenty expensive. So rather than make the fly line 200 feet long or 300 feet long and charge us 3 times as much, they make them about 90 feet long, and then we add Dacron backing underneath the fly line so that if you hook a big fish, you have extra line with which to play that fish until it tires and you can land it.
I thought that you said that backing was what makes your reel look cool. That's what it's for.
It can make your reel look cool if you're really into the way things look.
Because that's why I have backing. It's hot pink.
Which our listeners cannot see us right now, but if they could, they would know that I don't care about the way I look, so therefore I have all kinds of different colors of backing. Pablo, on the other hand, is pretty...
He's completely clad in camo right now.
Camouflage is a color. It's in.
It is actually in right now.
It's the new spring in.
It is.
Fish camo. Anyway, the arbor is the surface of the reel that you would attach your backing and then your fly line to. So the arbor on a reel varies in size. Old school reels, were very small arbor, if you will, so they wound a line very slowly. Mm-hmm. And modern reels, most of them are what they call large or super large arbor. So they're
big trees.
Generally, they're not trees. They are larger diameter spools that therefore take up line quicker and also store your line in larger coils, so they reduce memory and retrieve faster.
Okay.
So they're advantageous for sure to have a larger arbor.
Okay, and memory is just when you wrap a fly line around something, it tends to coil up, and that's called memory. Or it's not just fly line. It could be leader. It could be, your butt section of your leader. It could be anything. Tippet.
True.
So let's get to what everyone really cares about, which is the pole.
No, don't say that.
There you go. Somebody had to correct me. So let's talk about the rod. Because we have the fly goes on the leader goes on the fly line goes on the reel, and the reel goes on the pole. So it just sounds so weird, doesn't it, when you say it? It does sound weird.
My face is
I
making
don't know,
the...
I'm pretty used to it. We say fly pole all the time just for fun.
You guys probably do over there in Oregon. That's definitely an Oregon thing. Yeah, take my flagpole down to the river.
Oregon? Who lives in Oregon? I don't know what you're talking about.
Oh, Utah. You're in Utah. I'm sorry.
Yes,
Orem, that's
no
what I was
worries.
thinking. That was bad.
I'm not an Oregonian. They won't claim me, so you don't want to offend anybody over there.
Okay, fair.
No, but we do say fly pull a lot in jest. The fly rod, is a very integral part of fly fishing, right?
Yes, for sure. And they come in different weights. And I think that's kind of one of the more kind of confusing things about fly rods is that this weight thing, well, first of all, it's not weight. Weight does not equal pounds.
Right.
And most people think, oh, I need a big weight rod to catch a big fish. But a large part of the weight has to do with how big the flies are that you're casting. Is that correct as well?
Yeah, as well as the size of fish you might encounter or the size of leader or tippet that you need to help protect, or maybe not protect, but big fish you might need to apply a lot of pressure to be able to land.
Okay, fair. So what's the range of weights we're dealing with, and kind of explain roughly where they would fall as far as, fish species?
So most commonly they make fly rods from about 0 weight to 12 weight. You can find some models that make a double aught or triple aught on the super light end of things, and up to about 15 or 16 weight rods for large species. So if we were going to attach fly rods to species, and we won't cover all species because there are thousands and thousands of them on Earth, but most trout fishing is done with, let's say, 3 to 6 weights. There are always, again, these are, I said most, not all. You can use 7s and 8s for some trout fishing, and
2 weights.
You could
right?
use
a lot of people use
2 weights, absolutely 2s or 0s or 1 weights for some trout fishing also. But most trout fishing is done kind of in that 3 to 5 or 6 range,
okay,
where a 0 weight or a 1 weight or a 2 weight would be more for ultra light trout fishing, or maybe small panfish or something of that nature, or just where you wanted to have a really delicate type of presentation. If you moved up to, let's say, 6s and 7s are kind of on the heavier end of trout fishing, and the lighter end of super light end of saltwater, lighter end of smaller steelhead, let's say. If you went to 8 weights, then you're starting to talk, should throw in 6s and 7s and 8s for bass, are very common, and carp fishing as well. I don't know what you guys, I usually use a 6 for most of my carp fishing. What do you guys usually use?
I'm a 7 all day long. It's kind of the universal warm water 7s for carp and bass.
7.
I have an 8 weight,
Cool.
So that's because I use it for warm and salt water. So it's like, for me, that's my one-stop shop. It's actually in the shop broken right now. Yeah, I tend to do that a lot.
Bueno.
We'll get it fixed for you, Pablo.
Cool.
Thank you, Orvis.
Harvest time, everybody loves the harvest time.
Orvis plug.
Orvis will no doubt expedite your rod because they heard you on the podcast.
That's right.
I'm sure.
For sure.
Yes. Yep. Our friends at Orvis.
Orvis is being represented with your camo hoodie and with my broken rod.
There you go. I'm sure they love it all the way around. So moving along with fly rods, so 6, 7, and 8 are very popular for warm water species. And then 8s are also very popular for, again, lighter saltwater techniques, bonefish, redfish, that kind of stuff. They're also very popular for most Pacific salmon and steelhead. If you got into, say, a 10 weight, you would be on maybe roosterfish in the salt, or
Muskie, maybe? That's a muskie rod.
Muskie
right?
is a good one, yeah. 9s and 10s are very popular for muskie and pike for throwing large flies. Good point. King salmon's very popular with a 10. Permit, people like to chase permit with 9, sometimes a 10 if they're really big permit. And then if you moved up from there, 11s and 12s are most of the time tarpon rods. Again, you could catch other larger saltwater species. 12s on up, then you're talking billfish, sailfish, marlin. You're talking
Makos.
sharks.
Yeah.
Mako sharks, you're talking tuna fish, really, really large, very hard fighting game fish. But that's kind of the gamut of fly rods. So they come in different weights to accommodate different styles of fishing and different size of flies and different sizes of fish.
Yeah, that's a fun thing that I like to do. I like to put a little shark fin on and swim around and rail casting me with a 14 weight, and I just grab the line.
In the alley?
Yeah, in the alley. That's actually true. We do alley fishing here in Chicago. That's pretty funny. Let's talk about materials, because I know that these rods come in a whole, well, not that many materials, but there's a lot. And when I think about traditional fly fishing and kind of like that, utopian setup on a Montana river, and there's an old guy with like a, kind of big sun hat on, and he's casting, it's usually like some sort of wooden rod, which I know now is a bamboo rod.
Sure.
But there's, modern rods have changed a lot, although there's modern bamboo rods too. So maybe you can talk a little bit about the materials that they use to construct these things.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, kind of the really old school material is bamboo, split cane, and then moving from split cane,
isn't that a metal band? Split cane.
You would know better than me. I know a handful of metal bands. The cane was very popular and still is in some circles, right? There's, as you mentioned, they still make cane rods, but it was largely replaced for most fly rods in the 70s, I believe, for fiberglass rods. Okay. And then fiberglass was overtaken by graphite or carbon fiber, really. And carbon fiber has kind of been the end-all so far of fishing rod, not only fly rod, but fishing rod technology. And some rods use a mix of fiberglass and carbon fiber. Most of the really high-end rods these days seems like are using less and less fiberglass, but some oftentimes. And then you have some fibers like boron. Some companies have used boron for some of their butt sections especially.
Interesting. But I didn't realize that's why the rod was called that without naming names. Yeah. Interesting. It sounds very boron. Borophyll. Okay, so let's talk about action, because you had touched on it a little bit earlier, and I think that's like one of the biggest things that I learned, after a few years of fishing. When you start to get used to casting, you start to when you pick up a different rod, you start to actually feel like the difference in these rods. And I had a bunch of medium action, not a bunch, but 2 medium action rods, and then I switched to a fast action rod, and the difference was crazy to me, and I actually quite enjoyed it. Which I thought I wouldn't, because I typically tend to consider myself a not amazing caster. But it turned out it was okay. Even though I couldn't really feel the rod load, I guess my technique was good enough to get through this. So why don't you talk a little bit about action, and actually, Ray, if you want to too. Watching him cast is a joy. He's a beautiful caster. It's a joy when I'm in a good mood, but if I'm in a bad mood, I only have anger towards him. But
who wants to watch that?
Yeah. But yeah, and actually maybe your preference too. I'm sure people would want to know that as well.
Yeah, so action is how much the rod bends and how fast it recovers, or dampens, are kind of both parts of the action. So if we kind of put them in broad categories, you would have a slow or a soft action rod, a rod that bends a lot. You'd have a medium action rod that bends a little less, a fast action rod, or you could have smaller. You could break down smaller and go medium fast, and bends a little less, and then a fast action that bends less still, and an ultra fast action that is quite stiff. The tricky part with fly rods, and I think one of the reasons that all the manufacturers don't ever come to a standard here, is that, and by that I mean one company's fast action is not equivalent necessarily to another company's fast action. They all have their own feel for what they think is what they call a fast or medium fast. But because it's not just a matter of stiffness, if it was just simply stiffness, they could probably all have a standard. But because they all recover at different speeds and they all use slightly different materials and different resins and different tapers, there's a lot of variability in the action. But without getting too technical and above my pay grade on rods, the actions boil down to me to more technique specific. So I always, for beginners, I usually encourage people to avoid the extremes. Don't get a super fast rod, ultra fast rod, and don't get a super slow rod. Get something in the middle. Get a standard fast action or a medium fast, maybe a medium action, and you'll get a lot of fishing done with any of those actions. Yeah. And then people often ask, well, how will I know what I like? And you won't until you get into it, right? Yeah. There's no way to predict that. You may gravitate towards one action more than another as you get into it, but right out of the gates, you're just not going to know which action you might prefer.
Until you're familiar, it's impossible. It's the same thing with instruments. It's like people are like, well, what guitar should I get? I'm like, well, man, that's a loaded question.
So I think to kind of put it in maybe simpler terms, if you have a slower action rod is maybe a little more forgiving, maybe has a larger sweet spot, but doesn't have as much power oftentimes. And there are, just like all things, there are gives and takes. If you get an ultra fast action rod, it's probably the most powerful, but it doesn't bend very easily and you won't feel it load as well. Mm-hmm. It doesn't protect light tippet as well. If you get an ultra slow rod, it's going to lack some power. It's going to lack some line speed capability, some ability to cast into the wind. It's not going to throw big flies as well. It will probably protect lighter tippets really well, but it maybe won't fight big fish as well. So you're kind of, again, those are two extremes, and that's why we're kind of avoiding those two as a general rule. We're giving you something in the middle. A medium fast, for instance, would be somewhere in the middle that has characteristics of both that can accommodate a wide range of techniques and species.
Right. Let's talk about length, because I think that's another thing that is a big variable variable on these rods. If you're into Euro nymphing, you have a super, super long rod. And then some people that do this like small stream fishing with a bunch of brush cover and stuff, they might have a really short rod. So maybe you can touch upon that a little bit as well.
Yeah, and the other thing, I didn't answer your last question either about action. I don't really have a preferred action all the way across the board personally. I use Euro style rods that are quite soft. I use some small dry fly rods that are quite soft. I use heavier streamer rods that are quite stiff. Some saltwater rods that are really stiff. For me, it's all about the specifics of your technique and your conditions, I guess, for lack of a better term, that you encounter. What are you going to do? Are you going to throw big flies, small flies, big fish, small fish, light tippet, heavy tippet, and on and on? You can make several rods really work in most situations, but I tend to favor particular actions for particular applications.
Okay. How long does it take you to adjust from, let's say you had like a super slow bamboo rod and you were casting that, and then you had to go to like, some stiff streamer rod. Can you just pick it up and do it, or do you have to take a couple casts to kind of get to remember?
It'd just take you a couple casts, but it shouldn't take you too long. Just change your casting stroke a tiny bit, your timing a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean the nuts and bolts of the cast, the mechanics of the cast are virtually the same, regardless. The timing of it might be, right. The stop points might be slightly different, would be the same. The timing of it might be slightly different.
Oh yeah, here's a word that you always hear associated with rods, and that's swing weight. Can you talk a little bit about swing weight?
I could try. The swing weight, I think, is just what you're feeling. It's not necessarily physical weight of the rod. It's what you're actually feeling when you're casting the rod. So you could have two rods in your hand. On your right hand is a rod that weighs 1 ounce, and a rod in your left hand that physical weight weighs 2 ounces. But depending on where the balance of weight is in that rod, where you could have the 2 ounce rod might actually feel lighter when you're swinging it because of where the weight is in the rod. So swing weight can vary a little bit, but I think that's getting pretty technical, and really, and most fly rods are so light, I would argue most casters wouldn't really be able to feel a giant difference in swing weight, assuming all things are equal, that you're casting similar 5 weights or something. You would feel a lot of swing weight difference if you're casting a 5 weight and then you switch to a different brand in a 8 weight or something. But
okay.
2 brands and 5 weights, swing weight's going to be a little different, but not dramatically different.
Okay, it's good to know, because I think what a lot of us noobs do is we scour the internet and we watch videos and all these things, and you see these guys testing out these rods and like, oh, the swing weight on this is pretty good. I like this. It feels really good. And you're like, okay, well, what does that mean? They go to the other one like, swing weight. No. So just knowing that it's not terribly important, I think will help a lot of people if they're doing a deep dive.
To me, I would not put a lot of stock in what other people are telling you to get on the internet for a fly rod. If you're reading reviews and that people are saying that every one of them break, then that's one thing. Right. But I can tell you from selling lots and lots of rods and various manufacturers over the years, every rod breaks, and usually like 99% of breakage is operator error.
Right.
For instance, it doesn't matter whether you have brand X, Y, or Z. When you roll it up in your car window, they all break. When you fall on them, they all break.
Yeah.
When you fall in the river and fall on your rod, they all break. It does. That's not manufacturer specific.
Right. No, every time I break my rod, it's the rod's fault, man. I'm sorry.
It's clearly the rod's fault. It's amazing how many manufacturer defects show up about 10 years into the life of the rod, right?
Yeah.
I mean, a manufacturer defect should rear its head pretty early.
Yeah, exactly.
I was suggesting that I wouldn't put a lot of stock in what other people are recommending on the internet because they don't maybe cast the same as you.
Right.
I would argue this is going to be harsh, but here's like harsh rules, harsh reality. Let's call it according to Lance. Here we go. No. The harsh reality is that most fly fishers absolutely suck at casting.
Yeah.
That is a harsh reality. I've watched and taught hundreds and hundreds.
I know that because I'm one of them.
We're all pretty bad at it. We're all getting better. There's only one Steve Ray Jeff. I'm not the best on the planet, so I can say I can get better. Trust me.
That's true.
There's only one Steve Ray Jeff on planet Earth. He's probably the cleanest caster I've ever seen. He's amazing at both distance and accuracy. I have beat him before in distance. I would never claim that I could do it repeatedly or...
Okay.
But I have beat him before in distance. I have never beat him in accuracy. But there's only one. Steve Rajeff is like I don't know how many times, 15-time world casting champion or something. So he's kind of above and beyond all other
he's
fly
kind of like
right?
the Michael Jordan of casting.
He is the Michael Jordan of casting. No, there isn't a Michael Jordan is not a fair comparison. He's above a Michael Jordan in fly casting.
Okay, fair.
And Anyhow, most people are terrible at it.
He's messy.
Yeah, maybe so. I don't know. I think he's scored a lot more goals than anybody else. But anyway, most people are terrible at casting, and that's just the nuts and bolts of it because nobody practices except when they fish, and they think that that's practicing. That's not practicing. That's fishing.
I agree.
So I would encourage people to go cast, go to the park, and not on the water necessarily. You could go to the water, but if you're going to the water, there shouldn't be fish involved, and just practice casting.
Yeah.
If you say Ray is, I've never seen Ray cast, but I have no doubts that Ray is a wonderful caster. I would guarantee you that if Ray is a really good caster, he's cast at the park before with no fish.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, Ray?
Oh, yeah, 100%.
Most definitely. Hundreds and hundreds,
There
if
you
not
go.
thousands of hours.
Lance,
right?
I go cast in an alleyway when I'm bored.
There you go. See?
Yeah.
See, that's what makes Ray a great caster. Most people have never taken their rod out, just to cast it. They've only fished it, or their rods. We don't want to make people think they can only have one.
Truth.
You got to
Truth
have
in the
many.
booth there.
Yeah. Anyhow, if you, having watched hundreds and hundreds of people cast, they don't all cast the rod that I cast the best. Not everybody else casts it the best. So that's why I'm saying I wouldn't put a lot of stock in what you read on the internet about some other person or other fly shop or other whatever saying this rod is best or that rod is best.
Right.
If you find a rod that you like that's in your price point, maybe compare two very similar models, both in quality and price point, because the rods are often priced according to their quality, and cast them and see which one casts best for you. You should be able to go to a fly shop and test cast. If you can't, then maybe you got to rely on the internet. But I would recommend not relying on the internet if you can avoid it, because again, not everybody has the same casting stroke.
Right. Okay. That's really good. That's really, really good advice. And I think it's sound advice, and everyone should be listening up. Get on your casting pond. Get to work, people.
So we've covered weights, we've covered practicing casting. We need to cover length. So length of rod varies quite a bit. You'll find fly rods down to about 5 feet and up to two-handed rods up to 14 or 15 feet.
That's just a club.
It's just a little club.
It's a fish beater.
Most fly rods are probably 7.5 to 9 or 10 feet, right? Somewhere in that neighborhood. The most common length is certainly 9 feet.
But you kind of, as an all-arounder, I think you use a 10-footer. Is that correct?
I do tend to fish long rods for most trout fishing. That's true. That's kind of a new trend, let's call it.
Yeah.
When 20 years ago, everybody was using 8.5 and 9s. Nowadays, everybody's using 9 to 10s or even 10.5s. Some people even using 11s, for single-handed rods anyway. I do tend to prefer, for most of my river fishing and my lake fishing, I tend to prefer around 10 to 10.5 foot rods.
Right. Okay.
Where, a 9-footer is the standard, and that's a great rod for an all-around tool. If you're buying one fly rod for trout fishing, it's probably, again, that 9-foot, 5-weight, 4-piece rod.
Okay. Right. That is kind of like the industry standard. If you go to any fly shop, they're going to tell you to get that. It may or may not be right for you. It just depends on what kind of fishing you're doing, and I think that's one of the things that people need to think about, especially if they're buying their stuff online. You kind of want to think about where you're going to be fishing. If you're not fishing for just trout, then that might not be the best play. If you have a bunch of smallies or, largemouth bass in your back pond, then you're probably going to want a rod that's weighted a little bit higher. Or maybe you never even fish for trout. You don't have any, desire to do so.
Right.
So you kind of have to ask yourself, what's the species of fish that you're chasing and what size fly you're going to be throwing, and that will kind of help you decide on what rod you're going to get.
If I could say, that's
Great advice.
One of the bigger noob mistakes is that you just kind of go with the industry standard and not what your needs are out of a rod first when you buy.
There you go.
And a lot of folks get stuck in rods that might not be the most relevant.
Once again, always situational, right? Everything is situational.
100%.
If you live in Chicago, you have some trout fishing nearby, but it won't be what your main use of the rod
Right.
is. If you live where I live in Utah, we have tons of trout fishing with some bass and some muskie and some pike and that kind of stuff. So you're probably more apt to get a trout rod.
I thought you lived in Oregon, dude.
Well, you did think that, but the rest of us didn't.
No, I didn't. I just messed up. Well, there's one last thing I did want to ask, and you kind of just sort of skimmed it for 2 seconds, but cost is such a big part of this sport. I think a lot of people are intimidated by the cost of a lot of these rods. I know I certainly was when I started. How important is cost when you're buying a rod, or a reel for that matter?
How important is it? I don't think it's critical. Most quality fly rods are, let's say, if we're putting a round number on it, probably $100 on up. You can find rods that are less than that, but most of them that are less are pretty heavy, poor quality components and so on. But you can find pretty reasonable fishing tools these days for $100 to $200. But if you want the best of the best, you're looking closer to $800 to $1,000, maybe even a touch over $1,000.
Stacking money like 3, 6, 5.
Do you think that there are rods in those upper echelon price ranges that should not be worth that much, because a lot of people are like, oh, well, it's $1,000 rod. It's definitely good. I think that happens in a lot of things. The first thing that comes to my mind, because I was trying to do something business-wise with it, is wine. But like if you buy a wine from California, it's going to be expensive because the terroir it's just an expensive place to grow grapes. It's just an expensive place to have your vineyard. It doesn't necessarily mean the wine is better than something from your home state of Oregon or Washington, for instance. So I'm just curious if you...
It's probably better than Utah wine. I would just...
But so does that happen also with the fly rod thing, where it's like, you have these companies that are, charging a lot of money for a rod and it's not necessarily up par? It shouldn't be that much?
You're dealing with the largest pool of illegal money in the world.
I can't think of any companies that I think you would find everybody feels that way about. Fly rods are like all things. You have people that love some brands and hate other brands, right? Depending, if you poll 100 different fly fishers that have been doing it for 10 years or more, they're all going to have their favorite brands and they're going to vary quite a bit. I can't think of any high-end fly rod manufacturers that I think make terrible rods. I have my own favorites for sure, but that doesn't mean that they're the same favorites as everybody else, right? So I think that the cost of the rod oftentimes leads to the quality. They're not always synonymous, but most of the times you're going to have the more you pay in the rod, usually the lighter it should be, the more powerful it should be, the faster the recovery should be, the better the components, maybe the better the warranty, better the case, and on and on. Hopefully, if you're spending $800 or $900 or more on a rod, you're getting a premium product. You certainly should be.
Money, 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 money.
If I were to break rods down just in general at the time of this recording, you have basically, I feel like you have three kind of categories in rods, and it really comes down to where they're made. You have rods made in China that are the least expensive. Let's say maybe $30 to, you can find some China-made rods that are maybe in the $200 or $300 range. Right. Then you have Korean-made rods. The Korean-made rods are kind of somewhere in the middle. You have some Korean rods that get up into the $600-$700 range, and many more of them that are more like $250, $200, $250, $300, $350.
0 plus 1 plus 10 plus 158,022 plus 151,268.
And then you have U.S. made rods, and most of the U.S. made rods are about $400 or $500 plus. There are a few exceptions. There are some companies that make some U.S. rods into the $300 range, but you really don't find any U.S. made rods really under about $300. Pretty well, all of the high-end rods are made in the U.S. or possibly made in Europe.
Right. There's a lot of European rod brands, but we don't really get them here, right? Isn't that true?
We don't get very many of them, and most of the European rod brands are actually made overseas. There are very few that are actually made in Europe.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
I did not know that. That makes me feel good about my rod.
Well, I think your rod in particular maybe is made in Europe, but there are other brands that are European companies, if you will, but their rods are not made in Europe. Just like there are U.S. branded rods, we're not trying to throw Europe under the bus here. There are U.S. branded rods that are also made in overseas.
Yeah, of course. Let's keep trucking along because we're almost nearing the end, but not quite there yet. The next two things, I think we should maybe talk about them at the same time because they kind of fit together figuratively and literally, and it's waders and boots. Like I said in the last podcast, you really tend to see fly fishers in the river in waders, unless they're floating with like a guide or they have a boat or something. But walk and wade is the phrase that we use for rivers that we actually approach by foot, and normally you're getting into the river. If you're going to be set up, and that's the whole point of this podcast, you're going to probably need to get some waders and boots at some point. Mm-hmm. Unless you're fishing, maybe in Arizona or something where it's like hot all the time and you're fine just using your bathing suit.
Sure.
Some people can get away with that and just a pair of Converse, and that's fine.
Or you live in a place where you're always boat fishing, you may not need them. But for the majority of fly fishers, the most popular species to chase is trout, and most trout fishers are going to need waders.
Waders, maybe you can tell us what they are because maybe somebody doesn't really know.
Waders are a crazy jumpsuit you jump in that are waterproof.
That's, I don't know how else you would say that.
In the simplest of terms.
Well, there are lots of better ways to say that, but they're waterproof. I don't know what you want to call them.
Overalls?
Like they're almost like
overall,
suit, overall, but they have booties attached that are waterproof as well. And most quality waders have a stocking foot to the wader that's waterproof, and then you place, your feet and your legs in those, and then you put the waders inside of a boot that's designed to be wet inside and out. You can buy boot foot waders that have the boots attached. For most fly fishing purposes, those are not ideal because they don't offer a lot of ankle support and they don't connect to your foot very well. They're more of like the duck hunting marsh type of a wader versus most fly fishers want a lot of ankle stability and support. You're wading an uneven river. You have various types of river bottom, whether it's silt or cobblestone or gravel and slippery rocks and on and on. And so you can adjust your footwear based on your needs that way.
Okay, that's great.
Waders are generally breathable these days. It used to be that only a few models were breathable. Now most waders available are breathable. You could also buy some neoprene or nylon waders that are non-breathable. I would argue breathable is the best for just about every situation. Even when it's really, really cold out, I find I stay warmest in breathable waders. You just have to provide the layering underneath versus kind of one of the old school way of thinking was that neoprene waders, because neoprene insulates, are warmer. And they are for a short period of time, but because they don't breathe, they become clammy. So the longer you're in them, the colder you get.
Oh, interesting.
Versus breathable waders, if you're layering properly, with wicking layers close to the skin and layers of clothing that don't hold water, so like fleece, for example, you'd want to avoid cotton underneath waders. So jeans, for instance, are terrible. I scoff every time I see somebody jump out of their waders in front of the fly shop and they got jeans on.
All
I'm just like, man, what are you doing? What on earth are you wearing jeans for under your waders? But anyway, yeah, breathable materials underneath your waders that wick moisture away from your skin, help the breathability, and then you stay warmer longer with the proper amount of layers.
Okay. Here's something that I was curious about, because I know that this is like kind of a big thing, especially in the Euro world, is just, the stealth factor. How important is wader color?
Oh, I think fairly important, but there aren't very many waders that are made in anything other than drab colors. I don't know that your waders need to be camouflaged. It probably doesn't hurt to be camouflaged, but most waders are gray or tan or dark blue.
They're starting to go like darker, which I don't know if is good or bad.
Yeah, it's a little interesting, isn't it? It maybe shows dirt less. I don't know. It's an interesting thing. I prefer them not to be too dark because then they get hotter faster.
Oh, that's interesting. I hadn't thought of that.
I kind of like maybe a gray or a tan colored wader, but yeah, breathable waders, and then they come in all kinds of different sizes and all kinds of different materials. Some Gore-Tex, some Quadralam, some on and on. We can name a whole bunch of brands, but there are again various price points.
Or there's warm weather and there's cold weather waders also, and some kind of are utilitarian and will cover both.
For sure. Yeah. Most breathable waders would cover both if you layered underneath or removed layers underneath.
The good thing about breathable too is that, if you ate a burrito earlier in the day, it's not going to stay with you the whole time.
Up until you unbuckle that belt.
Until you get to the car and sit down and it all just pushes all the air out.
I don't know what you're talking about.
I'm sure you don't. That's something that I do request to any wader designers that are listening. It would be great to have a pee hole at some point, because
they have zippered waders.
Do they?
That's your front zip.
Yeah, just front zip.
I need like a square section, not just a zip. That sounds scary.
It sounds like you need a trapdoor in the back to let some air out.
There you go. I need that too. I definitely need that. I'm going to have to sew one myself. That'll be my new project.
There you go.
Little aqua seal and some scissors.
Yeah.
Okay, so what about the boots? I know the boots are a big part of it, and these boots my brother got are just crazy. They were very expensive, but they're so sick, and he seems to be in love with them. He says he can't even feel them when he's walking through the water or whatever. It's like as if they weren't even on his feet. So what's important when you're looking for boots?
Comfort, number one. Durability, ease of getting them on and off. The soles, you can get wading boots with different soles. So you can get some with felt soles, some with rubber soles, some with spikes, some without spikes.
Okay.
Oftentimes spikes give you better traction in the river. Felt also gives you very good traction in the river, but doesn't give you good traction out of the river. I think the most popular boots we're seeing sold the last almost decade are rubber boots that you either add spikes to or already come with spikes attached.
Right.
The exception would be if you spend a lot of time in a boat, whether that's a drift boat or a regular boat, the spikes can really chew up a boat. So then you might be back to just rubber or felt.
And then, when it comes to summer fishing, a lot of people do what's called wet wading, which is actually not using any waders. And you can use boots, you can use, sandals, whatever you want. It does get kind of cold unless it's really hot outside, because typically, and this is something we'll definitely cover in a future podcast, but trout tend to live in very cold water. Well, not very cold, but cold enough to make you cold. So some people don't like to wet wade. Also, for urban anglers like Ray and myself, sometimes wet wading in disgusting city water isn't the most ideal. You can get sick even.
Don't go up to the belt.
Yeah, you don't want to do that. It's we have a buddy of ours who does it often, and we're always worried about it. Yeah.
You never know what's crawling around in those waters.
That's true. But it's a good way to fish, and it's very fun. I tend to wet wade a lot in the summer when I'm not in some place that's sort of disgusting. And there's other ways to do it too. I even took a pair of Chacos and I put those spikes that you're talking about, I screwed them into my Chacos, and they are amazing, actually. They work great for wet wading. So you can do your own little hacks. It doesn't have to be something that's always super expensive and the leading cutting edge thing on the market. You can kind of make your own thing, and it works. We covered, let's start from the beginning. We got flies. The fly goes on the leader goes on the line goes onto the reel goes onto the rod goes across my face and I fall down, and then we have waders and boots that we wear. And the next thing would kind of be your pack, the vest, and the sling. So this is where you put all the things that you need when you're fishing. Your fly box, any sort of accessories, maybe water. In the olden days, they used to keep, the fish that they caught in the back of their vest or in like a little creel box. So let's talk a little bit about that. Recently, the vest thing has gone grossly out of style, and I tend to gravitate towards whatever the cool kids are doing. So I got myself a submersible backpack, and then I had the sling pack, and then ultimately I'm the only guy that's kind of gone back to a vest.
Nice.
It's so practical, and for me, I know where everything is, and I don't have to be digging through anything. So I'm now a vest guy, which I never thought would happen. But there's a bunch of different options. It's kind of depending on how much you have to carry, how much you want to carry. Your style of fishing, I think, comes into that too. If you are only fishing streamers, you have bigger flies. Those take up more space. And if you have multiple boxes, you need something bigger to hold them. If you're the kind of person that eats lunch on the river, you might need to carry something to hold your lunch, right?
For sure.
If I do like long trips, like when I went to the Sierras last year, we booked some time on this private stretch, and I was taking my backpack because I like to drink mate, the Argentine tea. So I'd bring my thermos, my mate, take a little break. Once I would get tangled and frustrated in the middle of the day when I was tired, I'd just take a little break there, drink some tea, enjoy the scenery. So there's different reasons to have different things. I know that you're using that Umpqua sling you guys at Fly Fish Food did a video on.
Yeah, the Overlook pack.
Exactly. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what you look for and what you use, I guess.
Yeah, I've used lots of things over the years, from vests to vest packs to packs with backpacks and hip packs and all on and on. The only thing I've never really liked is the sling. I'm an outlier there. We sell lots of slings. They're very popular. For me, they never made any sense. They don't hold enough. I don't like that I have to swing it around. It doesn't have a good option for nets, but lots of people fish without nets, and they like that it swings around out of their way. It's again, I would argue that packs and vests are much like many things where there is no right or wrong. It's all about what makes the most sense for you. So like you were saying, if you're hiking into the backcountry a lot, you might want a little backpack that holds rod tubes and lunch and a rain jacket as well as your fishing gear. If you're more of a minimalist angler, you might like just a tiny little chest pack or a very sparse vest, something like a mesh vest that has a few pockets for the essentials.
I prefer chip pack.
Whoa. Easy. I use different packs for different things. Like my guiding pack has a lot more capacity than my personal pack because I have to usually carry lunch and water and all kinds of things for the clients. So it needs more capacity. But again, there's no right or wrong there. There are tons of packs on the market from various brands. They're all very well made. They're mostly tailored to fly fishing. If you're buying the fly fishing brands anyway, they're all tailored to fly fishing, and they'll all do a great job. I think the things to consider, like for me, the reason I use the Overlook pack is that it's high. It's a chest pack. It sits high on my chest. I tend to wade deep often. I'm not often standing in really deep water for long periods of time, but in a river, I'm often crossing, multiple times a day where I'm over my waist. And so if I wore a hip pack, I would soak everything in the pack several times a day. And that's a real hassle. When I get home, I got to dry all my flies, which is thousands and thousands of flies. And so they don't rust. And that's not something I'm willing to do. Sorry, I wasn't trying to show off. I was trying to paint a picture of a problem that I've experienced in the past.
No, I know, yeah.
The chest pack keeps everything high and dry for me. It has enough capacity to hold what I need. The vest actually works really well too, except that it puts everything in the front.
True.
And then it tends to pull on my neck a little bit. So the pack that I wear is supported on my shoulders instead of on the neck, and I can put some stuff in the front, some in the back, so it's a little more balanced.
Okay.
Versus slings rest on one shoulder. They're usually quite comfortable. flexible. And if you get an ambidextrous sling, if you got tired on one shoulder, you could switch it to the other over the part of the day.
Yeah, the sling I have is for right-handed people, and I'm left-handed. So that's the other thing I got made fun of.
Oh, that doesn't work.
I took a surf fishing lesson in Southern California, and he's actually my friend now, but Ben was like, "Why do you have that thing on backwards?" I was like, "What?"
Backwards?
Yeah, I was like, "No, this is just how I have to wear it. I'm left-handed, dude." So yeah, for all the lefties out there, make sure you check that out when you buy a sling pack, because it's a thing. Just like scissors for us, but I'm not going to go down that road.
That's a whole nother wormhole. Got it.
Okay, that's good. We don't have to sit on that one too long. I think that was very, very thorough for packs. It's going to be personal preference, and it's kind of what you carry, you know. So the last little bit here, I think a lot of these things are super important, and I kind of put them in an order in which they're important to me. But I'm curious to see if you would put some things probably higher or lower. I don't know. So I'm going to name them off, and then we'll just talk a little bit about what each thing is and how it's used and what it, if it's important or not. So these are accessories. Typically, most of these things will live in your pack, in your vest, in your sling, whatever you decide to use. The first one is tippet bar and extra spools of tippet. I mean, I think pretty much everyone's going to say that you have to have that to fish eventually. Maybe not with your fresh leader, but as the day goes on, you're going to have to add some more if you want to be successful. So that's the first thing. The second thing is nippers, and those are just, most people use them to cut their toenails, but we use them to cut fishing line. The third thing would be a net, which you were saying some people like to fish without a net. I didn't realize that. I've started using my net less and less if it's small fish, but before I used to put every fish in the net and take a picture of it. The next one would be floatant. That's for the dry flies, which we spoke about earlier, is floatant and the silicone powder to keep them floating. And then the next one would be a thermometer to read the temperature of the water. This is just an educated guess, but I think Lance is probably one of those people that can just like put his hand in the water and be like, yeah, this is 56 degrees.
Oh yeah, no doubt. I just have a thermometer on my index finger
exactly.
for sure.
He's got the little mercury lines on his index tattooed.
Nope, I carry a thermometer too.
Okay, and then hemostats, which are important, but I also think they're less important now that people are using a lot more like barbless hooks, but I could be totally off on that.
Agreed.
I've lost so many pairs of hemostats that I just stopped buying them. They just seem to fly out.
And not only that, but they ruin your flies. Most people grab the body of the fly with the hemostats and they just shred the fly, right?
True.
So if you can just debarb a hook and pull it out carefully with your fingers, save yourself a lot of money in flies for sure.
And in hemostats. Where they do come handy though is when you're dealing with like toothy fish, either, like pike or if you're fishing in ocean species, saltwater. I feel like I like to have a pair of fishing pliers for sure, but
yeah, you got to have them. You just don't have to use them for every fish, right?
Right, exactly. And the last one would be split shot. You probably don't ever use that, I would imagine, but maybe you do. I don't know. So that's kind of the list, and it's in order. Yeah. So for me, it's tippet bar and spools, nippers, net, floatant, thermometer, hemostats, split shot. As I put thermometer lower, sometimes it would be number one, but I feel like the places I've been fishing, I kind of know well enough now where I know if it's the season. I can kind of gauge a little bit if it's the right time to do whatever, but maybe I'm being kind of a dummy for that. Maybe you would be like, no, you should probably be getting in there and figuring out exactly what degree it is. So I don't know. Let's get your 2 cents.
Nah, I don't think so. I think it's nice to have a thermometer for certain times of the year to know, if the water temperature is rising or dropping, or if, the afternoon warmth of the sun is warming it a lot, or if it just in the wintertime, how warm is it getting? It's interesting to keep track of those kinds of things and see, your experience on fish activity levels and that kind of stuff based on the thermometer. But it's certainly not something I break out every day, but it is something I have in my pack for sure. Okay. I liked your list a lot. Some of the things I would add: strike indicators for most nymph fishing is a key thing. I would add a hat to shield for me at least, my forehead keeps getting larger. I'm not sure why that happens, but
yeah, I seem to have that problem too.
Have to shield my enlarging forehead from the sun and to shade your eyes.
I'll never have to be worried about being, rescued off a deserted island, because all I have to do is just put my forehead in the sun and they will find me.
They'll see it.
Yeah.
It's like a mirror. And then polarized glasses are one that's often overlooked. You got to have that to cut glare and be able to see into the water so you can read structure and know where to fish and see the fish a lot of times.
Yeah, I think that's a big one. I did miss that one. I probably would have put that actually at the top.
Yeah, that's pretty important one for sure.
If I could add, have 2 polarized glasses for when you forget a pair. I did that this morning.
Oh, wow. You didn't have glasses and you were fishing for carp?
Ikey saved me. He has a second pair of polarized glasses in the car, and that's, you have a good pair and you have a kind of crummy pair that's just there for those bad days.
Perfect.
Yeah, and later on, we'll get into a podcast about sight fishing and kind of like, approaching the river, seeing the river, looking for boulders. But all those things require being able to see. And what polarized glasses do is they cut glare, they cut certain frequencies of light. Photons. That allow you to see through the water. So if you've never done it before, it's actually really interesting. The first time you do it, you look at a piece of water and you look down and you can actually like see boulders and stuff that you wouldn't normally be able to see without the glasses on. Actually, I remember my father-in-law, he's from Argentina. I told him about this and he didn't believe me. He was like, man, that's ridiculous.
Smoke and mirrors.
He's like, it's so American. You have to like buy glasses just to catch a fish, And I was like, well, it's not like that, but they're very helpful. And he put them on, he looked at the river and he's like, I don't see a difference.
You should tell him that all the cool gauchos in Patagonia are wearing them these days.
Yeah, for sure. Thought that was pretty funny. He's like, dude, that there's a difference. Unless you just can't see. There's definitely a huge difference, but
not going to let you have that.
Nope. Oh, my. All right. Well, I think that's pretty good. We did a really good job. I don't know how long we've been on here, but it's been a long time at this point. Lance is getting a sore neck over there. I can see him twitching. And Ray's been sitting with perfect posture this whole time.
Oh, I've been straddling this microphone and my back is killing me.
So I think it's probably about time to shut it down. You are listening to the Noob in the Knower podcast. This is season 1, episode 2. This episode was all about everything you need to get set up to go fish, from flies all the way down to boots, waders, packs, accessories, etc. Also, if you're interested in the pack that Lance uses, you can go to flyfishfood.com and they have it there, and they even have a video on YouTube, which we will link in the show notes, with him kind of showing why it's cool and why it's not. Actually, I don't think you say there's nothing cool about it.
It's all
just the coolest thing ever. Okay, fellow noobs and non-fellow noobs, thanks so much for listening to the podcast. And next week, we are going to be talking all about the different tactics involved in fly fishing, the ones you'll need to be successful on the water. And once again, we are here with Mr. Lance Egan.
Thanks for listening. Thanks for having me. And we look forward to sharing more about fly fishing with you next time.
That's right. And then Ray back here, he's been helping us on the 1s and 2s.
Oh yeah. Stay fishy, folks.
We'll talk to you guys later. Peace.
This was a Raul Maria production.